Today we're visiting one of my favourite little museums. It's a museum I found almost by accident a few years ago. And it's the Guildhall Museum. It's right on the High Street. To the left of us is Rochester Cathedral and Rochester Castle, which hopefully you saw the video on that a few weeks ago. But we're going to take a little walk around the Guildhall Museum, which has an excellent collection, really, of two things. One's Charles Dickens, because he was a favourite son of Rochester, and the other is the prison barges, the hulks that you might remember from Dickens' own novel. Great Expectations. Magwitch was on one of those prison barges and he found him out on the mud flats on the Medway. Well, they were quite a feature in the river by Rochester. So they've got a reconstruction, and there's also the beautiful Guildhall, which the last time I was here was actually closed and we weren't able to go in. We could just look through the door. But let's, no further ado, we'll get inside. We've also got a bonus. We're going to go around the Huguenot Museum, which is just down the street, and have a little stroll through one of the quaintest and prettiest high streets in Kent. And straight after the museum shop and paying the newly introduced entrance fee of £5, you have this pig where you can make a donation. I would like to see a bit of an explanation of why it's there. I'm sure there's a local reason for it. Fascinating little fire engine here. You can see how it was pumped. If you've seen our video of Shaftesbury Museum, they have a similar fire engine, but you can't see the pumps quite so easily. Here you can very much see how swinging those arms raises the pistons and pumps the water through the solid hose on top. We're heading up this wonderful staircase to first floor. It's a beautiful full height staircase, and we'll see a little more of that shortly. But first room has a collection of interesting items from around Rochester, finds from around the castle, the town seal, or city, Rochester City seal, along with some pottery and weapons, portions of masonry that have been found particularly around Rochester Castle. And this first room deals very well with the siege of Rochester Castle, which, as you could see, and hopefully you've watched our video on Rochester Castle. Rochester Castle is only the keep that remains now, but it's always been a very large, very dominating and strong stone structure. And ever since the Normans arrived, it was at the heart of intrigue. It was between the continent and London. It was here that Bishop Odo marshalled his troops when he took part in the uprising, the rebellion of 1088 against William Rufus. And during the Barons' Revolt, it was besieged for over a month after the Magna Carta signing. The barons still weren't happy with King John, so they marshalled their forces and they used Rochester as their base, and he besieged it and he did undermining, which is a reconstruction of how you chip out some of the stones at the base, put a bunch of barrels of very highly flammable and, if you can, explosive material, and undermine the walls, but it will topple. They did bring down one of the towers that way, and you can see an interesting reconstruction here, a model of Rochester Castle during that siege during the Barons' War, with a battering ram, some stands to provide cover for archers, trebuchets, different types of ballista. Very, very interesting little model. I liked it. Takes me back to my teenage years when I was an avid model maker. Very good reconstruction. Hopefully watch the video on Rochester Castle. You'll see it's a very fascinating castle. You don't have today the wooden hoarding along the top, which you can actually see a very good reconstruction if you watch our video on Caerphilly. That's probably the best one I've seen, where it gives you a ability to see the opposition and to fire from a place of safety without actually being exposed to the attackers. But obviously, being wooden has long rotted away at most, if not all, castles. But next, and possibly best section of this museum, is the coverage of Charles Dickens, where Charles Dickens moved to Rochester when he was a young man. His father had a job at the Royal Shipyards, and then moved back to London. And while he was there, his father pointed out Gad's house and said, "One day, if you work hard, you could live in a house like this." Well, years later in London, they left Chatham docks, and his father fell into financial problems and sent to the Marshalsea debtors' prison, which features very heavily in Little Dorrit, one of his more depressing stories. But when he was apprenticed as a lawyer, he was also writing, and he made a lot of money from his writing and came back and bought not just a house like Gad's Hill, but actually bought that house and moved into it with his family and lived in Rochester as one of his favourite places. As you go around Britain, it's very common to come across Dickens links. There are plaques to him in London, there's a museum to him in London. I think it was Portsmouth I was in, where there was a plaque where he was actually born. It's quite common. He was a very respected writer. I must admit, not maybe controversial view, not my favourite English writer at all. His stories are great, but he was paid by the words. There's far too many words for my liking. But there's some very interesting collection of personal items here. Advertisement for paper that he'd contributed to, photos of him, actually original photographs of Charles Dickens in his middle to later years, a series of plaques, Ivorex plaques, which were souvenirs for people of Dickens' characters. There's a reconstruction of his writing desk, a series of prints, a drawing of modern day Rochester, along with highlighting buildings which are believed to have inspired structures within his works, because he did have a vast catalogue of novels, and they're not just a lot of them, they're very long as well. They're full of fascinating characters, and we always talk about Dickens in terms of the people, but it was also anchored in real buildings, and it highlights that very well. We're back into the staircase and we're heading upstairs. There's some lovely paintings on the wall which I trying to get in the camera. Fascinating picture of the River Medway, and you can see this wonderful ceiling with the plaster work and incredibly detailed decoration also on the wall, but a truly stunning staircase. And at the top here is the Guildhall itself. The Guildhall, it's the hall for the guilds, and the last time I was here it was closed because one of the guilds was having an annual meeting. But you can see here, beautifully decorated, very elaborate, stunning wooden panel working, beautiful ceiling. There's actually a plaque about the ceiling, and also a series of paintings here. And you can see William of Orange and Anne feature very heavily. And they actually resided briefly in Rochester. There's a street on the High Street, the building that has a sign of where they stayed, because they entered Britain, stopped at Rochester on the way, and it was one of the first towns to welcome them during the Glorious Revolution. over in the corner there, fascinating sedan chair that belonged to a senior naval officer who was carried around in that sedan chair. It's actually an original sedan chair from roughly Napoleonic era. Here, some fascinating items belonging to Stanley, as in Stanley and Livingston. Horn, an axe, a pocket knife, I believe it's a knobkerry. He was born in Derbyshire and raised by his grandfather, who, when he died, he moved to America, which possibly explains the more negative interpretations of Stanley in later years. He's probably most famous in Britain for the Livingstone, I presume, which apparently isn't what he said, but he wanted to say something dashing and suave, and that's what he came up with. Back to the beautiful chair. Really stand chair, quite excellent. Very rare you see these other than on TV or a movie. But this was effectively the rich man's horse-drawn cart, except it was people carrying him. There's a reconstruction of the crown jewels. They're very good. I'd say you want to stand probably 6 feet away and they look like the real thing. If you get too close, particularly the top one looks a little plasticky. But probably the best you're going to see on this channel, as you can't film the real crown jewels on video, I don't believe. Here a series of jewellery for mayors and lady mayoresses, bracelets, brooches, the necklace of office with pendants, very elaborate jewellery stating the power and position of the wearer, and also a staff of office over there on the right. Some really beautiful pieces, very good condition, very well displayed, and quite unusual. I've been to quite a few town museums and you don't often get to see these. And these days when you see a Lord Mayor, they're generally just wearing a bracelet or necklace, that's it. Nothing too elaborate, because these are probably a little anachronous in the modern era. But beautiful pieces and really fascinating to get up close with them, along with a series of memorabilia items from the Second World War. The puppet at the top there was used to entertain the children during the war. And here a series of war medals. But fascinating room and a beautiful collection of items, all of which have some connection to Rochester. Here you see this wonderful ceiling. You can understand why there's a plaque on the wall when it was sealed, C-I-E-L-D, which is a fancy ceiling was put in place. But very beautiful room, very stunning with these windows looking out onto the high street. You understand from the outside it's a beautiful building, but you don't really expect such a stunning interior. I do like the chair. Very, very fitting with the room, I think. But we're going to head out, leave this room behind, and head to a very interesting collection that reflects on the naval and maritime history of Rochester, because Rochester is where it is because it sits on a narrowing of the River Medway. And the River Medway, with Chatham docks, and hopefully you saw our video on Upnor Fort, has a large and long and storied history in naval boats. And when we closed the naval shipyards, it was still a busy shipping lane with a lot of boats built here. So obviously you can't fit boats in, but there's a series of models of boats that were built on the Medway. An eagle-eyed viewer might think, doesn't that look like HMS Victory? Isn't that in Portsmouth? And it is indeed in Portsmouth and famous for Portsmouth, but it was built here in the Chatham dockyards and is a wonderful model of it. Then series of plaques on the wall explaining history from the man who jumped in to save a young girl and then drowned himself, to ships that sank here, and people who sailed on the River Medway, along with ships that were deliberately sunk that have been built here, and there's portions of material from sunk ships. And at the end of the room is the bridge of a tug, because at the heart of construction of ships and navigating large ships down a river like the Medway is actually being able to ensure they don't crash. So tugs have always been very important here. And there's a very good use of mirrors here. See how the mirror enlarges the room. There's a Russian Cold War submarine which is still actually moored the other side of the bridge. Unfortunately, I don't believe open to the public at the moment. But that mirror there gives you an idea of how they create space and a feeling of scale in some of the later exhibitions. Certainly very well done, because this is a small building that they have to fit a lot into. And here is the steering house of a tug coming through docks. You can see the machine room instructions on the wheel there, and obviously the wheel for steering the ships, which there is a little plaque asking you not to swing it wildly. It actually doesn't move at all these days. But a beautiful reconstruction of the tug, along with some items for children to play with, and a whole collection of naval uniforms, swords and hats, and items from the history of the Navy in Rochester. Really very good. If you're in Rochester, you can also pop to the beautiful cathedral. Excellent castles just next door. We're going to be going to the Huguenot Museum in a while, and High Street's well worth a walk as well. This is a wooden cabinet for a woodworker, and it's described as one of the best in the world. It's a box for the planes, hammers, jigs, saws, and its entire mobile toolkit like a DeWalt of its day. And now we're heading into the hulks, where the mirrors really come into their own. You get a feeling of being on board a ship in what is actually quite a small room. And this is a reconstruction of a hulk, which they were naval battleships of the line, which, as you can see here, hopefully the camera picks it up, when you spin the wheel, you see the hulk being made. So a battleship at the end of its years would have the rigging and everything expensive and military removed, and then be fitted out as a prison with cells inside. I'm sure it was a miserable, wet existence living on one of these, and any attempt to stay dry would be quite difficult, and I'm sure the British soldiers weren't particularly happy to be guarding French prisoners. But there's a lot of items, as well as this reconstruction of the hulk itself, there's a lot of items of the work which was carried out. Here you can see the stern castle of a ship. With the blunderbusses, they're actually fixed to the woodwork so that you've got a steady aiming position. Lovely level of detail. I think they've done a very good job for a small town, small museum. I think they've really done an excellent job. And here you can see down through the ship, again a clever trick of the eye, where the rest of the exhibition is in the rooms below, And they've created that when you look through this hole, it looks like you're looking down through the decks of the ship. And you don't want to be too deep down in the deck. I'm sure it's not very pleasant at all. Collection of police and naval clothing down this dark and dingy staircase. L'ennui, la fame, le désespoir. Loneliness, hunger, and despair. Probably sums up the experience of being a prisoner on one of these ships. Prison barges were not as civilized as they are today. Down below, there's some cells, there's good explanation of the experience. And if you dare, you can smell what it smelt like there. I would describe it as stinking men. It's basically what it smelled like. Sweat and stink. And then explanation of the life of a prisoner of war. Wasn't too uncivilized, but it wasn't particularly sanitary or pleasant place. And you can see that the prisoners slept in hammocks hanging from the ceiling of the deck, along with bars to make sure that they were contained at night. So probably a boring and draining experience living in these ships, and later the hulks were used by people being transported to Australia. But those people actually transcended that experience. They didn't just take it laying down. They were allowed to make items and sell them for profit. And you see items that they drew, and they took straw, and using straw they glued pieces together and cut and trimmed them and tinted them, and you can see these wonderful items they created. Along with, at the top there's a knife made out of bone, a workbox made out of straw. Really fantastic piece of very detailed marquetry using just straw, not even wood. Different items that they made. Quite fascinating works of art, really. Beautiful items. And it's fascinating to see this collection. You sometimes read about them in history books, but it's very rare you actually get to see the work that was created by the Frenchmen on those ships, because people spent years on those ships. Here's a model showing a reconstruction of a ship out of bone and straw. Very interesting area. I think the hulks is probably my second favourite bit after the Dickens section in this museum. And you can see the ship itself, really a masterpiece. To make that out of small fragments of bone really is something. Very impressive. Painting of the end of the era of the Hulk, because there came a point where they were no longer viable and there was no longer the surplus to requirement, so they were disposed of. Here, a small room really in the staircase side corridor, but a whipping post, so you would have been manacled by your hands to the post and then whipped. And you can see from 1596 right the way through to the 18th century, this was public form of punishment. And I'm sure it was even less fun than being on a hulk, having your hands manacled to that post to be whipped. Here are a series of items related to the origins of the police, with truncheons, some of them quite elaborate, helmet, and really the growth of the police, the spread of the police from London out to smaller towns. Very interesting eye. I particularly like these two painted truncheons. They look almost ceremonial. You're less scared of being hit by them than scratching the paint. Down at the shop on the way out, there's an interesting collection of items that have been found around here, like Iron Age spear, buckets, some tiles, some old Roman coins, a hoard of scrap metal it's described at, but really it's axe head. And here's a large range of Roman coins from different eras during Roman Britain, along with some mosaics and some flooring, some pottery. Quite a interesting little collection here. This is all from the surrounding of Rochester, which even back then, because of its location, was a strategic spot for the Romans. There's nothing left really visible from the Roman era, but they do still have finds and a nice little collection on the way out. But we're going to head down the high street, and at the end of the high street, I promise, is a treat. Apart from the Huguenot Museum we'll come back to, which is actually quite a small museum on one floor, there's also the high street itself, which I particularly enjoy. And here's a Paleolithic hand axe. You can see how they've knapped the stone to create a sharp blade, along with some dinosaur. Is a mammoth a dinosaur? You tell me in the comments. Mammoth tusk, some fossils from the chalk in the area. And actually, if you stand on the bridge that you can see just down there, you can see chalk cliffs in the distance even here. But we're going to wander down the high street just to give you a feel for a beautiful old high street, which is much better preserved than most. You could be excused wandering round Canterbury for thinking it's a great old city, but actually it's a reconstruction after the Baedeker raids during the war. That little bookshop on my left claims to be the biggest second-hand bookshop in Britain. If you walk the length of it through the maze of shelves on multiple levels, I would say it's probably a fair claim. It really is huge. Not a place to buy cheap books, but if you're looking for something obscure, which is very hard to get hold of through Amazon or charity shops, and you're happy to go second hand, then it is well worth a visit and very interesting collection. Love the pub sign, the George Vault. Over to the right here, you can see a tilted house with very narrow medieval lane, along with early 20th century bank, which is now a pub. Beautiful wooden houses here on the right. The Wolf and Castle, and you can just sneak a peek of the castle through that narrow lane. There's a better view here of the cathedral, which is definitely well worth a visit. And here's the clock on the front of this building, featured in one of Dickens' works. Beautiful building. And the whole way down is an eclectic collection of architecture. You can see here this castle-inspired structure through to this open space. Opposite, gorgeous Georgian and Victorian and Edwardian building. But well worth a little stroll down here. I do like this old pub. If you've seen the Moorcroft Museum tour we did, you can see these tiles. And here you can see Rochester Cathedral and the castle with this old town wall gate, which still stands very strongly next to a Tudor frame building. Really lovely little high street that has a quirky character to it, which is so often missing in modern high streets, are mainly post-war monstrosities or repeat box copies of each other. But here, small enough town, but it's not flooded with the usual big name stores. And along with a lot of structures that have plaques on them commemorating interesting events, the Huguenot Museum's just up here on the left-hand side. And after that is the French hospital that was founded by Huguenots, who a lot settled in Rochester after arriving from the fleeing persecution in France and St Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And a new edition, lovely white Ferrari here. Some interesting charity shops. If you like charity shops, well worth a visit as well. And here's the side of the cathedral. Very striking building. And always seems to be a nice sunny day when I come to visit Rochester. But just ahead there, you can see the columns on the left-hand side of the Huguenot Museum. We're going to skip past it down to the end of the street to see Dickens' chalet. And then we'll be back to the Huguenot Museum. The public garden is a chalet that was gifted by a French actor, Charles Dickens. And it's where he actually wrote some of his works. It was given as a birthday present. Unfortunately, it was closed off today. But luckily, here's one I made earlier. We've been here a couple of times. This small wooden chalet was a gift from a French actor. And it was constructed in the gardens of Dickens' house. And when that was demolished, it was moved here. And it's slowly being repaired. It is open occasionally. I've never had the opportunity to go inside. But it's, think like a grandiose garden shed. It came flat packed like an IKEA building and was constructed in the grounds. And Dickens loved it. I mean, what a present from anyone. It's certainly better than any summer house I've ever had. Really beautiful structure. All of that Victorian detailing. And really quite a fascinating piece of history that Dickens sat here and wrote some of his most famous work. So had to just pop along and see it because Rochester is full of little references to Dickens. And even if he's not my favourite English writer, sorry, he's a great British writer and raised issues of social consequence that are still really resound today and are still very popular books and films as a result. But a fascinating little structure and a little piece of Dickens' real life here, sitting 20 metres from the high street, probably passed by a lot of people. Next we're heading off to the Huguenot Museum. The Huguenots were a French Protestant group. They were Reformed, effectively Calvinists, and comes from a Swiss political leader, Genevan Burgomaster Besançon-Hughes, which was ended up being turned into Huguenot. And they were heavily persecuted in France. Particularly if you've seen the film La Reine Margot, there's the St Bartholomew Day Massacre of 1572 drove about eventually 50,000 out of France, and 10,000 of those came to Britain. A lot of them settled in Kent. If you go to Canterbury on a Sunday, there's actually a Huguenot Mass to this day in French. And across Britain, they were very welcomed and received with open arms because of the Philo Protestant religion, but also because they were skilled craftsmen, they were intellectuals, they were great contributors to society. And this museum, it's very small, but it captures the essence of the Huguenot movement. It shows the numbers of people who came, some elements of their life. The French hospital, which is just a few doors down from the Huguenot Museum, was actually founded by Huguenots. And they contributed in terms of both medical and philosophical, and particularly skills. And there's a very good, if small, collection of silverwares and goods that were made by Huguenots. Although there's only 2 rooms here, it's a very sweet little museum, well worth a visit. I actually had the chance to get in for free because it was an open day. And do check if you want to come here, because it's not always open. I've tried 3 times to get in and always come when it's closed. But excellent little exhibition. I'd call it an exhibition more than a museum, and that's not criticising. It's just difficult to have a collection of such a niche subject. But it's also really nice to see a niche museum that covers this topic, because the Huguenots over 400 years have both maintained their identity as French Protestants, but at the same time integrated and contributed a lot to Britain. You can see a banknote, and the reason the banknote's there is that the first governor of the Bank of England was actually the son of a Huguenot, and they take it very seriously. You can actually pay £35 to have your family lineage checked against the Huguenots. I knew someone who always thought they were a Huguenot, and they paid the £35 and never mentioned it again. So I guess the answer was no. But really excellent little museum. There's also a lovely doll's house, because it's made by Huguenots and it's one of the best doll's houses of its time. All of this silver and metalware was made by Huguenots, and you can see the level of skill involved. It's very highly skilled silver work that they brought to expand what was already a growing industry. If you watch our video on the Science Museum, the second one, there's an excellent collection on the Enlightenment, and it shows a lot the crafts around silversmithing and also clockmaking. There's the excellent collection of clocks there. But really lovely museum, definitely recommend you coming to visit, but do check in advance. Here's the doll's house, absolutely gorgeous for basically a 200-year-old doll house. And also there's these little pieces of furniture that you can get a bit more up close and personal with and see just how fine their craft was. Well, I hope you enjoyed our trip through Rochester and the 2 museums and the little treat of Charles Dickens's chalet. Check out the video of Upnor Fort on the other side of the river and the Rochester Castle, and join us next week for another museum, very different one.